you could do that maybe you didn't think about doing otherwise. But let's, Randall gave a little bit of my background. I do quite a bit of investing myself. Most of the properties I buy are on seller financing. And I usually get the call if somebody's got an interesting question on seller financing. We'll be covering, at best, the tip of the iceberg. So don't feel bad if you walk away from this feeling like, oh, I still have a number of questions. I'll make sure and get Randall the link, but we teach a 3-hour core CE class on this as well that I think will certainly give you 3 times the information, but also a much better understanding. But I always like to start out with what are the benefits for the buyers and sellers of doing seller financing. And oftentimes people intuitively understand the benefits to the buyer, but they don't always understand the potential benefits to the seller. And I think the best way to think about this is if you were buying versus if you were selling. So obviously, some of the benefits to the buyer are not going to be benefits to the seller. So don't get them confused that they're all benefits for everyone. When we talk about benefits to the buyer, oftentimes the buyer is getting a lower interest rate than the market rate if their realtor is negotiating it well for them. Right now, I would say the majority, so more than half of what we're closing, the buyer is getting a better than market rate. And if we were in a classroom setting, I would ask all of you, what the major factors, the major reasons buyers are not buying right now. And when I ask that in the CE class, the first thing off of people's lips is the interest rates. Second comes with, maybe they just can't qualify based on how much the payment is, or can't qualify for another reason. But if you have a buyer with a down payment, there's always a seller financing transaction to do. I'm sure Randall's got examples where he's purchased properties with a little or no money down, but I'd say in the past couple of years, the lowest down payment I've personally done was $5,000. So sometimes, the buyer, maybe they don't have it all now, but we do a lot of, and you can write this down, deferred down payment seller financing deals where they'll put an amount down now, and then when they get their tax return, they'll put an additional amount. This is kind of where creativity comes in on your part. The second point, no credit qualification or social security number required. The qualification is decided by the seller for the most part. And as you can imagine, oftentimes the majority of that is going to be the down payment. If you've got a property where they're putting down 30 or 40%, that's pretty good qualification for the seller. And depending on what type of seller financing they do, if they take the property back, they'll end up with that equity. So I'll leave that as a teaser because the type of seller financing you do does make a difference. But if any of you out there are listening that speak Spanish or have somebody on your team that speaks Spanish or Portuguese or another immigrant language, we see a lot of movement regardless of the market with those types of clients. And I personally speak fluent Spanish. I love that group of people, love to help them out. And we see that once an agent does one, everybody talks to everybody within that community. And it seems to become a steady flow of buyers. But if you have a buyer that, a bank would say no to, but they've got a good down payment and they can make monthly payments, you can turn that into a transaction for yourself, but more importantly, you can help them to be a homeowner. Sometimes the buyers pay a little bit more as far as sales price. But if somebody bought a property 5 years ago and paid 10% more than market value then, how nice are they sitting now with all the appreciation that's taking place? And then for those of you that work with investors, there's no limit to the number of seller finance loans somebody can take out. So if you have somebody that has 10 loans and they're running up against, lending issues, it's a great thing to introduce to them because it's almost infinite. I've never had a seller that said, this buyer has too many loans as part of their qualification. It could happen. But as Randall mentioned, especially right now, a lot of sellers are willing to do seller financing. So we could probably go through a whole day seminar on all the ways to structure a deal to benefit the buyer and all the potential benefits for a buyer. But this would open up the current market to any buyer. So your job, and some of the agents, this I love, they'll come to the CE class and they'll walk away and they'll go out and do 3 or 4 of these within a 30 to 60 day period, because the agent's job is to find the clients. And all of you have marketing that you're doing, you're still in the business, you're successful. I would suggest that there are 2 very, very hot points for marketing right now that you could incorporate. One is seller financing. The other one is assumptions, we're not going to have time to go into too much on assumptions, but suffice it to say, if you're doing a seller financing where it is an assumable loan, so it's going to be FHA, VA, USDA, or SBA is also assumable. It's a very good idea to include in your contract that the seller will participate once the buyer pays out their equity with the assumption of the underlying loan. That way your buyer not only is probably going to get an incredible interest rate, but also they're only going to have 20 years left to pay on the loan instead of starting a new amortization. So if you can figure out a way to market that to your clients so that people understand, they go to some other agent, they're probably going to get a 7.5% interest rate. But if they go with you, potentially they could get a much better than market interest rate. The best interest rate I've picked up recently was a 2.5% interest rate. That's what the seller had, negotiated it, where that's the rate that I got. So you can do some really powerful things with buyers. And the other thing I would suggest that a lot of agents have figured out is, even if you get 10 phone calls off of your marketing because somebody wants to get a better than market interest rate seller financing, if they end up buying a property with you and it's not seller financing, it's a normal loan, you still help them get into a home, you still help them get a commission. But the buyer benefits, I think people understand, because most buyers know they need to do seller financing. Now the seller's benefits, this is where it gets really kind of interesting and fun. Before we jump to that though, let's go over a couple more buyer items. Buyers can buy and sell the same day on seller financing. I believe Randall's done this as well, but one thing I love to do is buy a property, maybe with a 2.5% interest rate, resell it at a much higher interest rate. I just did one in Magna where the purchase price was $270. It needed about $70,000 in repairs. It was not in great shape. But I sold that to a tradesman who knew how to do most of the repairs that needed to be done. The after repair value was going to be $440. So I actually sold it at $440 without making any of those repairs, and required in the contract that the buyer make all those repairs that I would have made, and then got an 8% interest rate, whereas my underlying rate from the seller was 3.5. So if you're wondering how, I had an agent come to the class and within 4 years, they'd made $2.2 million net off of what they learned. A lot of that was due to what I just described. So if you study market cycles and analytics, you know that now is the best time to buy when other people are hesitant. But you can do some great things with buying and selling the same day. And then buyers can purchase the property and fix it up and sell it without hard money. Hard money is pretty expensive right now. A lot of hard money lenders are kind of much more conservative because they have a number of properties that they've had to extend loans on. seems like I get a call every other week from somebody that's either lent money on one of those or potentially losing the property to seller financing. So the ability to do that is powerful, to go and get properties without having to get hard money. All right, so let's go through some seller benefits. Typically, you are getting a higher sales price on seller financing because you're providing two assets. You're providing the loan and you're providing the home. We see a lot of these, again, where it's about 10% above market price. But another thing we're seeing is that sometimes a seller will use a better interest rate to get a much higher price, or vice versa. They'll use a kind of a market sales price instead of a higher sales price, but then get that 8, 9, or 10% interest. The other thing that I found is it seems like everyone in Utah wants to be a landlord until they actually are. I don't know if you've had any clients that fit that mold, but we're seeing a lot of people that are done being landlords. And if they just sell the property, they get a huge capital gains hit. But if they sell it on seller financing and their accountant does it right, they're only taxed on what they receive as they receive it. So if you know an investor that's maybe looking to get out, it's a great way for them to sell the properties. I had a mentor phrase it to me this way: when I rent properties, I get cash flow and headaches. When I sell a property, I get a chunk of change and taxes. When I sell on seller financing, I get a chunk of change and cash flow, but I don't get the headaches. I don't have to go unplug toilets, change out water heaters because I've sold it. And the way you sell it does make a difference. We'll get into more on that probably at the end of this slide. But I don't know if any of you are fans of making money off the bank's money. I certainly am. So again, on that one that I gave an example of in Magna, my interest rate's 3.5% on a low loan amount, and I sold at 8% on a higher loan amount. So I'm making more than I would have actually if I'd rented the property, because people will pay to be an owner. And again, all of that work that had to be done to the property, I didn't have to do any of it. And he's now completed that work. It looks beautiful. So if I end up taking the property back, that's a bonus for me. And if any of you are in a situation where you have a client that you know of, where maybe you've heard somebody in the office talk about it, where they bought it right before interest rates went up, and now they are in a negative equity situation. You can do seller financing on negative equity situations. You don't want to have a situation where the buyer owes more than the seller does. So if you're going to do that, please call me. I'd much rather see everything done correctly. And I usually see these one of two ways. I'll see them when I'm asked to help on the initial setup, and I'll see them when I'm asked to fix them. And it's not as much fun for people when I have to fix it. But if you have that negative equity situation, usually you can take that seller from doing a potential short sale, destroying their credit, to a situation where the loan is reinstated if it was behind, seller actually walked away with some money, your commissions got paid. And so it's a great thing that you can do to help those sellers that are kind of in a hopeless situation. So I want to talk a little bit about the tax benefits. I touched on that. If you have somebody that's going to be hit with capital gains tax and they get hit all at once, that's generally going to affect them negatively from a tax perspective. So you can use seller financing as a way of stretching that out. We'll oftentimes have somebody who bought a home down in St. George, and they've been kind of going back and forth between the two, and then we have a winter like we had last year, and they decide to sell one of the houses. Surprisingly, it's the one in Salt Lake with the snow to shovel. And since they've been living more time in St. George than Salt Lake for the past few years, again, they've got that potential large tax hit that they otherwise could spread out over time with the seller financing transaction. And they're only, again, taxed on what they receive as they receive it, Another question I'll get is, does seller financing, even though the seller's maybe not getting the bulk of their money, does that qualify for the capital gains exemption? The answer is yes, it does. So I'm curious to know if anyone has any questions at this point regarding buyer or seller benefits or anything that maybe they're not clear on. If not, I'll just continue. So I've mentioned a couple of times how important it is to know what type of seller financing you're dealing with. Oh, go ahead.
Looks like maybe it was just some background noise, I would guess there. But
Okay.
you know, one of the things maybe just to touch on really quickly is there was some bad information that was given out at the UAR convention down.
That never happens.
Yeah, down in St. George here a couple of months ago, they were talking about it was actually one of my friends, but they were saying, oh, you know, the banks are calling the loans due with the higher interest rates, you know, et cetera. And it's really risky to do seller financing transactions. And so I reached out to attorneys and title companies in several different states, and nobody had seen an increase in banks calling the notes due, probably because most of the banks are on pretty slippery slopes right now. Even US Bank was on the, you know, top 100 most at risk banks, I think, in the US. And so I think it was a top 30. Do you have any comment on that before we go forward?
I do. Let's start out with an analysis that was brilliant that one of my lenders who's been in the business for a number of years, 30 plus, he's owned several large companies, running another one now, mortgage companies. And he explained it to me this way. The majority of loans currently are serviced by servicing companies. Servicing companies have to usually buy the rights to service the loan. So if you just paid $1,000 to make $100 a month doing the servicing on the loan, and that's your business model, you're not actively seeking to get rid of those loans that you had to pay to start servicing. So servicing companies, I think, have made it a little unique. Now, you always want to start any discussion from a license and liability standpoint. You as agents should never use a phrase such as, don't worry, the due on sale clause would never be called. I think that would be
Unwise.
Bad legal advice. Yes, but there has not been an uptick in banks calling these due. I can tell you, and please tell your friends, there are certain lenders that you do not do seller financing where title transfers.
Utah Housing was one of them, right?
Utah Housing would be the primary one. About once a year, I will get a phone call, and the one this year I think happened in April, and it went something like this. If I'm not going to do my impersonation of a very frantic agent, but she was very frantic when she called. They had, and I'm not going to mention what title company it was, but a title company, and all title companies now are claiming to be seller finance experts. So beware, you've been warned. But this person had been told it was okay to do an all-inclusive trust deed over a Utah Housing FHA loan. Now, there are two issues. We'll start with just the Utah Housing issue. Utah Housing is the lender that will look at the tax notices and start a foreclosure if the title has changed. So you need to be very, very careful. There are transactions that you can do that will go through where it transfers ownership but not title. Still a violation of the due on sale clause, but has not caused issues yet with Utah Housing. But another one that you could potentially use is a lease option. But a lease option, it's generally a very small down payment. and certainly not enough to pay the agents, and your commission's technically not even due until the end of the transaction when they actually complete the option, exercise the option. So a lease option is a form of seller financing, but it's generally not the best for the buyer. Because it's a lower down payment, it may not be the best for the seller. But let's talk about the other part, doing an all-inclusive over FHA. If you've written nothing else down, and I see 3 names under Randall's, Wendy, Brittany, Kevin, there's a 4th, Ryan. Write down, do not do an all-inclusive trust deed over an FHA loan. And there's a lot of talking heads out there. There's even another attorney that's saying it's okay. I don't go based off of, well, I haven't heard about it happening for a while, so it must be okay. If I'm going to give advice, it's going to be solid. It's not going to be a guess. And so I actually spent quite a bit of time until I finally got a meeting lined up with one of the regional offices for FHA. We had the regional director, the vice director, the head legal counsel, and then some other guy. I've got his name written down and everyone else's, but I don't remember what he did. He talked a lot, though. And I went through this exact scenario with them. I said, do you still have the prohibited transactions list? And they said, yes. I said, okay. If you do a lease option, will that get you on the list? They said, no, but it still technically is a violation of the due on sale clause. I said, what about a contract sale? And the head legal counsel said, you mean like a contract for deed? And I said, yes. And I was kind of holding my breath for a moment because I knew what I thought the answer was, but I wanted to make sure. And they said, also a violation of the due on sale clause, but will not get you put on the prohibited transactions list. And then I asked about, what if you do an all-inclusive over an FHA loan? And they said, yes. They said, you and your company might be banned from doing FHA transactions. You potentially as an agent for life, even if you're on the seller side. The brokerage for 1 to 5 years potentially. So it's something we haven't seen in a while that they've actually done it, but it is definitely still there. So I would strongly recommend not doing an all-inclusive over an FHA loan, even if your title company says they're good with it. But hopefully, Randall, that answered your question sufficiently. But no, I've not seen an uptick, but you need to be careful with certain lenders.
Sure.
So we touched a little bit on the contract for deed, which is the second form of seller financing that we see used quite heavily. So if you thought that I misspoke, I didn't. The contract for deed transfers ownership, but not title. And if you think all the way back to when you were studying for your real estate test, title is not ownership. Even in a normal transaction, ownership transfers at the point valid consideration is given for the deed and the deed is delivered. That's when ownership transfers. The reason you record at the county is because the county is a registry of deeds. When you record at the county, by statute, everyone in the world knows that ownership transfer has taken place. Now, with the contract for deed, you still record a notice of the contract because even though we tend to trust sellers, we never want to have to rely on that trust. But it is a very useful tool. Now, we went through the buyer and seller benefits. Let me tell you a little bit about analysis regarding the difference between an all-inclusive and a contract for deed. When you sell on an all-inclusive, that is the strongest position for a buyer. So a buyer obviously would want that. People will sometimes call me and ask me, what's my favorite type of seller financing? I don't have a favorite unless you tell me what my position is within the transaction. If I'm the buyer, I want an all-inclusive. The only time I wouldn't want that is if it's an FHA loan, or obviously Utah Housing, which is FHA. But as a seller, I'm probably going to want a contract for deed for a number of reasons. The first one being liability, and that's how I always start my analysis. When I sell on an all-inclusive, I'm looking at a 4-month foreclosure process. So by statute, the first 90 days are a redemptive period in which the buyer can redeem the loan and continue with paying the note. After that, you may or may not know, there is no requirement that the seller redeem. So, if you're doing transaction where the 90 days has passed, the bank can actually say, we're not accepting a reinstatement any longer. We're only going to accept full payment. Now, in practice, they rarely, if ever, do that, but it is a 120-day process. The contract for deed is a 30-day forfeiture process. So you've got kind of a much safer scenario for the seller. It still protects the buyer because the buyer can redeem during that 30 days. It's just instead of a 90-day redemptive period, it's a 30-day process. So again, which one you want to do is going to depend heavily on whether you're representing the seller or you're representing the buyer. But let's go through the end if the buyer defaults. We know that the seller's process under an all-inclusive is going to be longer. It's going to be more expensive to do a private party foreclosure than just a forfeiture like you would do under a contract for deed. But there's another key element, and this is why I love to buy on an all-inclusive and sell on contract for deed, preferably within a 24-hour period. If, let's say I did that deal 3.5 years ago, right? And now there's huge equity in the property. On that one in Magna, they put down $128,000. So big equity we're dealing with. At the end of the foreclosure process, there is a public foreclosure sale. That means if Randall bought that property and resold it on an all-inclusive, and now there's $300,000 equity, and he's owed $500,000 on his note, I can show up and bid $501,000, and if I'm the high bidder, I walk away with the equity, not Randall. Now, if Randall had sold on a contract for deed, there is no public auction at the end. It just terminates the contract, and the ownership fully vests with the seller again. So if you're working with investors, or you're doing this yourself, or you're consulting with the seller, it's something to think about, that equity might come back to the seller in that instance versus just going to a public sale. Now, one final note, these can be used in combination. So we've done a lot of lease option to contract for deeds. We've done, where it'll start as a contract for deed and then go to an all-inclusive once the seller the buyer puts down additional down payment. So you can really do some cool things for your clients when you understand how to use those and which one to use. I would just propose that now you know as much or more about seller financing than most agents out there, and frankly, a lot of attorneys out there. But risk has to be compensated. So in the CE class, we go through all of the costs of doing the foreclosure or forfeiture, how long those timelines are, and it's everyone in the class understands that down payment needs to be bigger the farther down this list you go. So there's no hard and fast rule, but typically in our office, if it's 10 to 15% down payment, we're seeing a contract for deed. If it's in that 20 to 30% down payment, we're seeing an all-inclusive. But again, there is no hard and fast rule on that. So before I jump off of this, it's a fairly important slide. I just want to know if there are maybe any additional questions on that, or maybe you've heard something, a friend of a friend said, they heard this or they heard that. I'd love to answer those questions.
Hey, Jax, I have a quick question.
Yes, who am I speaking with?
This is Kevin Tarma.
Kevin, how are you?
Good, how are you, man?
Doing well.
Awesome. Hey, real quick, so if we're representing sellers, what would you suggest we advise them as far as the capital gains, go? Obviously, we always referring to a CPA or to a tax person, right, for obvious reasons. But what's what's a couple of things that we could suggest to them as far as the capital gains go?
Sure, that's a great question. So Kevin, your first answer was the one I give. I usually phrase it as, you should really ask the person you'd be sitting at with the audit, because that's not me. But
Right.
since you're asking for general information, a lot of investors have been, when they do the purchase and then resell very quickly of the property, they're doing a hybrid lease option contract for deed, where it starts out as a lease option for 12 months and a day, and then it converts to the seller financing. So the seller financing portion remains dormant, so that it's a lease with an option initially. And I'm sure you'll recognize they do that so they can get a long-term capital gain versus a short-term capital gain. I am not a CPA, but all of the investors, their CPAs have signed off on it, and it's they've been doing those types of deals for almost a decade, and I have not heard of that not working as far as getting them to the long-term capital gains. So that's an important tax tool. Another one is, if you have somebody that is in a situation where they work in real estate and it's going to be counted as regular income, and they're going to make a lot off the flip, they may want to consider, instead of just cashing out, doing a seller finance transaction, because instead of bumping them up into a much higher tax bracket on all their income, if their accountant files it correctly, they'll just pay tax on what they receive as they receive it, which is a much kind of softer tax landing than getting hit with the whole thing up front. Does that answer your question, Kevin?
It does. It does. If it's a seller that's not an investor, and let's say they just own it for a couple of years or so, and they want to sell it on seller finance terms, is a normal rule that the typical, $250K per single person, $500K net for a married couple. Is that kind of what you suggest to them, or?
Yes, yeah. If they can qualify for the capital gains exemption, and this is a critical thing. If you have somebody that has lived in the property, but their goal is cash flow, there's actually some liability for an agent that doesn't understand seller financing, because if the agent says, oh, you want cash flow, we'll just rent it out, now they've given up, if they're married, $500,000 capital gains exemption on that property. And once they figure that out, they may not be happy, and they've been actually damaged because they sold it on a lease, or they didn't sell it, they leased it instead of selling it on, for example, a contract for deed, which is 27 days more risk. I mean, instead of a 3-day notice, it's more of a 30-day process. But if they sell it and qualify for the capital gains exemption, that exemption is on the moment of sale. And with the seller financing transaction, that moment of sale is when you close on the seller financing, as long as it's something that passes ownership, like a all-inclusive or a contract for deed.
So can you hear me, Jax?
I can.
So one thing that I saw that I thought was fairly creative was is almost an extension of the 5 years. How you have to live there 2 of the 5 years, because they seller financed it to somebody else, so locking in that deduction, and then that other person made the payments on it, and then turned around and sold it to somebody else and got them their money a little bit later. That was actually a friend, and I don't know how that would work out, but it extended that period from 5 years to like 7 years, because the friend bought it. Their terms were, seller financing terms, interest rate, payments, whatever, but with a balloon payment within 3 years. And so
and the reason that worked is they sold it on seller financing, and that's their moment of sale for capital gains.
Yes.
So even if the seller financing went 30 years out,
yes,
that principal portion that qualified under the exemption would still not be taxable, is what my accountant has told me. So, okay, well, that's a very good question. Any other questions before we jump off of this one?
Sorry, I got cut out. I just came back. I apologize, but I did hear the answer. Thank you, Jax. Appreciate it.
You're welcome. My pleasure. Okay, so let's go to the next part.
I had a quick question. I just
Sure.
put it in the chat, but my name is Josh here, and
Welcome, Josh.
on a seller financing deal, how long is the term, and is there a balloon payment? Like from what you've seen, are you doing like 30-year amortization with like a 5-year balloon payment, or what's typical in this?
You know, that is a really good question. And there are points in the market cycle where you do have averages. This is one where we've actually seen a lot of prepayment penalties instead of balloons. And I'll clue you guys in on something that is an amazing thing right now. The biggest reason sellers aren't selling is because if they go and they buy a house across the valley that's the exact same house, exact same sales price, they could easily more than double their interest payment. And so, you know, the media is calling it the golden handcuffs. So can you as an agent figure out a way to solve that, right? And this is the best way I've found to solve that, and how some agents right now are killing it with listings. It's one of the reasons we're so busy, is because no one else could do these deals, so they're doing all those deals. Imagine if you could sit with every seller that's sitting on the sidelines and help them understand just this simple principle. Let's say they've got a 3.5% interest rate. If they sell their current house, right, so that obviously the sales price is going to be more than the loans. So they sell it at 8% interest, which is not uncommon. If they're getting 8% on their equity, but on their and the amount the bank's loan, so let's say that's $250,000, they're still making more than the bank is on the bank's money. And when you take all of that money and you apply that to their new payment, we've had that completely make a new house payment before. So oftentimes they're getting a better than 3.5% rate as far as how much they're actually paying out of pocket on the new house. So now you've taken off those golden handcuffs. Their mom, who just got their license as an agent, doesn't know how to do that. So you can get that deal. I don't know if you guys have noticed, but it seems like everyone in Utah has a relative that's an agent now. So it really is coming down to knowledge and expertise. But if I was an agent and I was great at doing listing presentations and coming up with those leads, I would absolutely go back to everyone I'd marketed that had said no thank you, and all of my new people I'm marketing, and make sure they understand that. And on those deals, we're definitely seeing prepays, because you don't want that cash flow to end, because it's helping to pay for their new property. And the great thing is, if rates drop, because, you know, not that I would ever suggest the government is going to mess things up and throw us into recession, but you never know. I mean, markets cycle. But when they drop rates to counteract that economic slowdown, that your listing seller, again, you got two commissions, you got his sale and the new purchase, they're going to have a great refinance at that point while still making 8% on the old loan that they had. Now, there are some additional considerations. It has to be structured so that the seller can immediately qualify for that new loan, but we've closed hundreds of those. So hopefully your question gave people that $1 million idea that they needed this morning, because there are agents literally they're on their way to making millions as long as the market holds with that simple thing. So short answer is, we're seeing longer terms than we used to, because sellers like making that cash flow. So we're seeing either no balloon or extended balloon payments, but we're also seeing a lot of prepayment penalties, because the sellers don't want that cash flow to end, especially if they have almost no equity left in the property and they're making money just off the bank's money. Why would you want that to end? So hopefully that not only answers your question, but gives you a good idea of how to take advantage of the current market. Did that answer it okay?
Yes, and just kind of a follow-up question to that. Are you seeing interest only seller financing loans as well, or are they typically principal and interest?
Typically, they're principal and interest, but I think that is to a great extent because a lot of agents that are setting this up don't understand the power of interest-only payments. You want to be a little cautious about doing anything that would be a negative monthly payment. Call me if you're going to be doing one of those. There are some additional concerns you'll need to deal with, but interest only is fine. We've done 60-year amortizations, which is fine. It's funny because in the class I'll say, we've closed a 60-year amortization a few months ago, and everyone's like, oh my goodness. I'm like, we also do infinite amortizations. It's called interest only. And then they're like, oh yeah. Good questions though. I appreciate those questions.
I think that's really a good point that you made, because if I sell my house, let's say I sold my house at 5%, which is 2 points below, market right now. I think right now we're at 7.27 or whatever. So if I put that at 5% over here and I go out and buy another one at 7.27%, I'm getting an effective interest rate or a blended interest rate of about, less than 2.25%. So I mean, it's lower than it ever is before, and I'm able to use that to help, like you said, make the payment on the other one, but get, even if it was just dollars for dollars, same price, 700,000 here, 700,000 there. That's a 2.5% loan this way.
Yeah, but most agents are marketing it as the take your interest rate with you or the benefit of your rate with you program, and it's really, as you can imagine, powerful in the current market because sellers have given up hope on selling till rates go down because they don't want to buy a high rate, and you are bringing the solution to their pain. You're bringing that answer. So hopefully someone will take that and run with it. I also want to just suggest that one of the big issues with seller financing comes from the seller financing addendum that you guys are given to use. It's got a lot of holes. It's got a huge liability issue that I've actually talked to the commission, the real estate commission about. They had me come up and, they were all sitting up there being like magistrates, and I went through 10 points with them. And every point they would turn to each other and go, oh yeah, we got to fix that. Well, they fixed one. They did put an addendum number on the form. But I got so tired of agents asking me to help them draft addendums to fix that addendum. I just drafted one that deals with, did you know that actually, it's funny, Randall, I don't know if you noticed this, the MLS seller financing addendum doesn't even have an amortization spot. Like, it doesn't say how long is it amortized for. Is it a 15-year term? Is it a 30-year amortization? So I filled in those holes. I mean, insurance is another hole that form doesn't deal with. Randall, if you'd like, I don't charge for that. I'll send it to you. You can send it out to people. They can use a clause if they want. They could use the whole thing. But I think, especially for those that don't consider themselves seller financing experts, it would help them to understand the additional tools they've got to make a deal work, but also not to miss things that might be problematic in the future. Do you want me to do that, Randall?
Yeah, that would be great. And,
Yeah.
it's you want to work with the right title company. I mean, it's a big deal, but I personally don't use the seller financing addendum that's on the board. We do our own. We just
Can't imagine why.
Yeah, we just use an addendum and copy paste, what we want into it. So yeah, no, that's a really good thing. Thank you, Jax.
Bet I'll send that over. All right, so we've got, and I know we can go a little over, but 12 minutes of scheduled time left. So I want to jump to how agents are systematizing this to really be successful. And one of the reasons I like systems, I think they're brilliant. I probably haven't eaten a McDonald's hamburger in 3 or 4 decades. I'm not a big fan, but they sell an incredible amount of hamburgers because they have a system. You go to a McDonald's in New York or California, you can order the same menu virtually as you can here. So systems are a very good thing. Most agents start with buyers when they're starting with seller financing. I kept getting questions from agents, you know, follow-up calls. Hey, how can I do this? How can I get into it? I think Randall would agree, but I've never seen a better seller financing market in my life, like ever. There are always additional negative factors. I mean, in the 80s, there was a good rate differential, but there were some additional issues. And so I think if you're not doing seller financing, unless you're just so busy you don't want to do more work, I would incorporate it as a tool into your toolbox. But agents would ask me, what are some ways I can get started? So I came up with a list. You're welcome to write these down. Kind of how do you get people into your buyer pool? The first one is my favorite. Lending partners. Lenders are absolutely dead right now. So if they get a call from a realtor, like it's going to make their year. You might be able to save their 2023. The reason you would call a lender is because they may have people they've talked to that have a down payment but can't qualify for a loan for whatever reason currently. And one of the myths I'll dispel right now is seller finance buyers are not garbage buyers. I shouldn't use that term towards another human. That most seller finance buyers are not buyers that should still be living on their mom's couch. How's that? Is that a better way to phrase it? We have some agents that they market lenders and say, hey, who do you have? You know, who do you have that has a down payment? The average Chase branch has 10 of those people per month that have a down payment but can't immediately qualify for a loan. Imagine how your bottom line would be if you got 10 referrals from just one branch a month and you were able to go then find them houses. We talked about it. If you run into the short sale where somebody bought it right before rates went up, maybe you know somebody in the office with that listing. Go team up with them. You can help them out. One of the things that I've found when you're building your business for seller financing, don't just throw it up on the MLS, because every listing is a huge bait to get seller finance buyers in your door. Get permission in writing to, obviously you have to put on the MLS now, but to also market to non-MLS sources. It's all Craigslist, Zillow, Facebook Marketplace. And what seems to be most effective is you tell about the property, but they have to call you if they want to know, you know, additional information. One of the agents I have that does a lot of this, he'll put in something specifically because people don't know what it is, so they'll call. He puts, I specialize in non-bank financing contract for deed. And he was doing a property, it was a high-end property, and somebody drove by one of his signs and called, and it was another seller that had a high-end property. The seller's property had been on the market for almost a year. It was probably a little bit overpriced, but the agent that had the listing had been kind of dropping the price incrementally over time, and you know, it still wasn't selling. And so this agent called my agent and said, well, what is a contract for deed? And he explained it, and she said, I would love to sell my property that way. That would be great. And then she divulged that it was listed with another agent. My agent said, you know, I can't help you because it's listed with somebody else. But the seller didn't give up. She went and talked to her agent and said, I want to do seller financing. And the seller's current agent actually said, oh, seller financing, I don't do that. He can have the listing, the new agent. So the new agent raised the sales price back up to what it had been at the beginning of the listing. And in the class, I love asking people to guess, how long do you think it took to sell the property? Well, since we're not doing raise of hands, I'll just tell you, it took 8 days. The offer they accepted was $300,000 down. The backup offer was $150,000 down. Now, if any of you are old enough, I'm probably the only one to remember Paul Harvey and the rest of the story.
Yeah.
It's actually kind of a cool rest of the story for this agent. He went, closed both sides of the purchase. The guy that bought it was from Park City, had a $2 million listing that wasn't selling. So my agent got that to take over that listing as well. He took the seller and went and bought another property. And then a few months after the initial sale, the buyer's wife kicked him out and moved in her boyfriend. So in retribution, the buyer stopped making the payment and the seller took it back. And then this same agent sold it to the backup offer, the $150,000 offer. So that's obviously not going to happen on every transaction you do the seller financing, but you will find that there's such a demand right now that people talk to their friends and say, yeah, I found an agent that actually can do this, this, and this. And it becomes a referral source. It's a good referral source. So that non-MLS marketing, so that you get buyers in the door so that you can help them either buy the property you've listed or find other properties, is key. Other agents are a very good resource. If you have somebody that you know that has buyers or sellers that aren't buying because of interest rates, go team up with them. The guy that probably closes the most of these is an agent. Won't let me teach my 3-hour class at his brokerage, because anytime they have anything, they just give it to him and he gets half the commission for sending it to our office. So other agents can be a good resource. Past clients, you'd be surprised how many of them may be ready to sell or possibly buy another property, or maybe they've got equity that's dead equity. It's just sitting there and they want to buy a property and resell it. This is something we did quite a bit when rates were good. And Randall, I don't know if you were using this, but a group of agents that we kind of have a seller finance mastermind once in a while, they found some lenders that would give an investment loan using the contract for deed sale that was taking place the next day as part of the qualification for the buyer's payment on the investment loan. So it was full disclosure. Everyone knew what was going on. And then they went out and they would find buyers with 20% to put down. So their past clients could go pull out a home equity line with that debt equity. They would use the home equity line to close on the investment loan. And then within 24 hours, their home equity line was paid off with $1,500 a month on a property that a seller finance buyer bought. Now, the great thing for the buyers was they could pick any property out there. They didn't have to just go off the ones that were listed at seller financing. And 2.5 years ago, there weren't a lot listed seller financing like there are now. But also, that investor buyer, if things went wrong, they took the property back on the forfeiture. Now they've got a property with 20% or more equity. And like I said, a group of buyers that want to buy those properties. So it was a great way to do business. And the agent got the initial sale, the second sale. It was great for the agents as well. So you can always use this, even when rates are low and the market's hot. There are things you can do. If you have investors that run systems, hopefully they're incorporating it. Large corporations, if you're not in with large corporations, they usually have a favorite or in-house real estate company. We've had a few agents that have been able to go in, and because those companies like Adobe and those big companies moving people from the coast maybe to Utah, they may not have sold their house in San Francisco. So they can't qualify for both payments, but they still want to buy a house. And he went in and was able to solve that problem. And so on all the ones where they couldn't immediately qualify for a loan, he got the deal. Same thing with UDOT, a government company. I had an agent that went in and got all of their people that were getting kicked out for the Western Corridor Road. They couldn't immediately go buy a house. The smallest check he had to work with was $74,000 to go find a seller finance property. So there's some cool things you can do if you have an in with one of those companies, or if you have business owners, listings. Please use your listings to get more buyers. And then my second favorite one is 7 referrals. Typically, somebody in a seller financing position where they need to buy or sell that way knows 7 other people in a similar circumstance. So again, you'll start with buyers. Sometimes the buyer's issue, yeah, they've got a down payment. In fact, we've seen a lot of this where the people had a business, it was successful. Because of COVID, their business didn't do well. And now, you know, they're restarting, but they're making a lot of money again because they know how to do that business. And they've got a big down payment. They just can't get a bank loan. So finding those people is critical, but also having a lender or somebody that can fix their credit is a good thing, so you don't have to. And I've got some lenders that do free credit repair. I'm sure you guys know people as well. But that's a good thing to have when you're doing seller financing. Use your listings to get buyers, but also, you know, sometimes your listings usually will be new seller finance buyers, or in the very least, new buyers for you to go find a house for, because you structured the seller financing so they could immediately qualify. And then always start with the final closing in mind. This goes back to licensing and liability. If you have a buyer that puts down $100,000, they're excited. You got paid your commission at closing, which is what usually happens on seller financing. But then you put them in a 2-year contract, and they had just had a bankruptcy and a foreclosure, so they're not getting a loan within 2 years. That could be problematic. So always start with that final close in mind. Make sure you're setting it up to be successful, right? It's not worth closing just to get a commission. You want to make sure those clients are in a good spot. I may tell you on a deal, hey, the way you've structured it, you might want to think about incorporating this. You might want to think about putting something in where the buyers make an additional $5,000 principal payment at the end of the term and it extends for a year, something to protect that client. But hopefully that's been helpful for you. Like I said, I'll send out the seller financing addendum to Randall. He can forward that on. I often find that smart people will take a picture of this with their phone, and really intelligent people will actually put it in as a contact, something like Jack's Seller Finance Pettey. And that way, in, you know, 3 or 4 months when you're like doing one and you're like, oh man, who was that guy? I've got a question. I've got a question on default remedies, or I've got a question on what is the cost if you have to do a foreclosure or forfeiture, or my seller. This is one I'll get quite a bit, right? Let's say you had not done seller financing before, and right now you're sitting there and you're like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. Like, it just clicks. But in the back of your head, you're like, I'm going to wait till I know more. I would just suggest 2 things. First of all, in the live class, the next one's in January. Randall, you're welcome. In fact, I'll send you a link, Randall. You can forward it for people to register. But do it fast, because once we like open it to the general public, it's always full. Did you, when you, let's say Randall was your first broker, did any of you go up to Randall and say, Randall, I think I could do this. I've got some potential people I could talk to about it, but I want to wait till I know everything about real estate before I close my first deal? Has anyone ever told you that, Randall?
Yeah. Yes, sadly, I've heard that a couple of times.
And how successful are those agents? But yeah,
so tell them all they need is to know 7 numbers. Who to call.
Your phone number? Yeah, that is correct. So if you go out and you talk to a seller or you talk to a buyer and they're like, oh, that sounds interesting, I just don't know. A lot of times those newer agents that are newer to seller financing will schedule a 5 or 10 minute call, and you can schedule that with Randall, you can schedule it with me, so that somebody can answer those questions. And you'll learn more in that phone call than you will from an hour's training like we've done. But more importantly, you're probably going to get to do a deal, which is how you actually learn the business. And after that first deal, you're going to say 2 things. 1, that is a lot easier than I thought it was. And 2, I probably don't want to ever work with a bank again unless I have to. But don't handicap yourselves. You've got people that do know the answer. Your job is just to go out and market the heck out of it, find the people. Because right now, knowing seller finance is the $1 million gold mine. And I think you see that by the number of MLS listings that are offering seller financing. You're seeing that wave. Don't wait till the wave goes by and have to paddle in yourself, right? Surf that wave. Let's open it up to questions.
Hey, Jax, this is Julie.
Yes, Julie, how are you today?
Good, thank you. I actually did call my broker and they didn't offer too much information. And I feel like, and I do have a client that wants seller financing and I haven't been able to find one for them. But and I feel like I need to learn some more, but how do I find this CE class? Because I've been looking all over for classes.
So,
more. This is just the tip of the iceberg, like you said.
Yeah, go ahead and email me at that email address that's on the screen and just say I'd like the registration link for the class.
Okay.
And I'll even send it to you and then send it to Randall.
Thank you. And then I did take another short class and they said that absolutely they don't, a lot of brokerages aren't allowing their agents to do seller financing with the underlying mortgage, that it's so dangerous because of the due on sale clause. And it was a class from Berkshire Hathaway and they said they can't do it, and if they have a seller that says they want sellers to do seller financing and they have an underlying mortgage, they have to tell them no. Thought that was just kind of interesting. Yeah.
It's tragic, really, because there are a lot of good agents that are handcuffed. And I don't want you to think that there are not brokers that are proponents of seller financing like Randall is. They're out there. And they help you do more deals. These brokerages, all you have to do is go back to the 80s. Because the same thing happened in the 80s. There were brokerages that felt that they were, prestigious enough that they didn't need to lower themselves to doing seller financing, and those brokerages disappeared because people weren't taking their clients down to the bank to get a 21% mortgage, right? It was all being done with seller financing. So we're in another one of those cycles where seller financing is a critical tool. Here's the big issue I have as an attorney with that, though. The brokerage is not part of the sales contract. The buyer and the seller have the sales contract. They are parties to the contract. They can agree to what they want to agree. So it's actually a huge liability issue for a brokerage to come in and say, we're just, as our position, we're going to say you can't do the type of transaction that's the most beneficial for you. And if you look at how much a seller might lose by not doing seller financing, especially if it's a 30-year term and they've got 3.5% interest, they're selling at 7.5%, 8%, that's a huge potential claim. And I hate to say it, but right now, the courts landscape for agents and brokerages is not rosy. So I think they're making a huge mistake, not only from a practical, like their agents being able to make a livelihood standpoint, but also from a liability standpoint. And I just can't fathom an attorney that understands litigation and liability signing off on doing that. But I know there are brokerages doing that, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right as well. I mean, so we've done hundreds of these. I've never had one called due. I had a friend that did over 510 states. He had one called due and the note was by a private, note holder, and so it wasn't even a bank. And it was John Locke. Yeah, John Locke was his name. Here in Utah, one of my friends had one where the bank called on it and then never followed through, so it's kind of could it happen? Absolutely. Randy Smith is on the one of the commissioners at the Utah Division of Real Estate, and we had some of our brokers were freaking out about seller finance, and he's like, well, if you got like 9 pages of disclosures like Randall has, he said, I don't see a problem with seller financing. He's listing all these different things that could go wrong. You fully disclose to everybody. If you've disclosed 9 times that there's the potential for the note to be called due, even though it hasn't happened, or that I haven't experienced that. Personally, you're good. I mean,
And
just,
Randall, do you have, I want to make sure I get all this information, like your, Jax's contract. It's because we put in an offer on a seller financing and I used the seller financing addendum. And I'd like to get the new one from Jax. I want to make sure that I'm
Yeah.
on the list. Okay.
in fact, you could email him directly just to make sure that you're,
Okay.
you get it there. I mean, is that okay, Jax? She emails you directly.
Yeah, did everyone get that, or should I put it back up?
If you want to, let's see, let me put it in. Let me put it in. Let's see, where's the chat here? Maybe stick it in chat, and they can. They're Jackson. Then they can copy and paste it.
Certainly.
And Randall, yours that you're just describing with all the disclaimers, how do we get that?
You send me an email on it, and I'll send it over to you. I'm actually in the process of having one of our attorneys combine it, an updated one with the one that we've been using. So I'll just send it over to you, and you can use whatever you want. So,
and what's your handle?
Mine is best. I'll put it in there. Okay. All right. You bet. So there it is. All right. As we finish up here, I just want to take a couple of minutes to first to say thank you, Jax. I appreciate it. We all appreciate it. And yeah, if you're not doing seller financing, you're like sticking your arm behind your back, because you listen to him say that seller financings are 8-to-1 at their title company right now. And 2 months ago, I heard title companies telling me 500% to 700% increase in seller financing. It's an amazing deal. We talked about locking the interest rate that you have on your house. If you're going to buy a new house, effectively you're walking it to the new house, because you're selling on 5% seller financing on the existing home. And then if you buy a new home, you're paying the difference between the 5% that you're getting and the 7.25% that the new one is, which is 2.25% interest rate isn't bad for home purchase. And then if the rates go down, like Jax mentioned, it just gets better from there. And so there's a lot of amazing things you can do. I do want to share the screen really quick. We're getting ready to do our yearly trip to Nepal, where last year I took 21 people to Nepal with me, and agents, not just from Equity, but from other brokerages as well. We spend 10 days in Nepal, sightseeing and working in our charity. So we do jungle trips, mountain villages. I'll go through this really quick. Nepal is amazing. It has lowland jungles where you have tigers, rhinos, elephants, other types of wildlife along the rivers. And then it's got Buddhist temples and Hindu temples, burning the dead on the side of the river. But our main focus is the kids. And so we're there. We spend half the time split between helping children in the slums and poor indigenous villages and sightseeing. And so it's a life-changing event. Let me run through here and see there. We do health camps. We teach them on the ground like Mother Teresa did. We work in schools. We have over 700 children in our core program, and we do outreach to about 2,000 children. We dressed everybody up this last time in Nepalese dresses, and then had a dance that was kind of fun for people that came. But it's an amazing time. And then the 8 tallest mountains in the world are all in Nepal. So there's 8 mountains over 8,000 meters that are there. I can send you more information on this trip, but we're teaching these kids in the street. They're sitting on rice bags in this area here. So we have 700 children in our core program, and we do outreach to 2,000 children in other schools. These schools are so poor that they don't have writing paper. The only writing paper that these kids have are the paper that we send every year. And so some of my agents have gone more than once. Mike Vielstich has been to Nepal, got chased by a rhino. And But it's an amazing trip, and it's one that basically it's a once in a lifetime adventure. And I ran through that really quick, so you can reach out to me. Just shoot me an email. I'll be happy to talk to you about it. The cost is typically about $3,000, including airfare. It's not a moneymaker. My wife and I act as tour guides along with our team in Nepal, and so get your airfare wherever, whatever price you can, and it's cheap. It's $20 a day for food is what we figure. And about if you want your own room, it's maybe $35 a night, 25 to $35 a night for most nights. So super cheap. 10 days in Nepal. Meet us in Kathmandu on March 20th, and we'll pick you up at the airport whenever you come in, and then we'll drop you off at the airport on March 30th. And so I had from all over the state. I took 19 people up to the Australian base camp, which was, a great adventure. We climbed up to that. Just a lot of amazing things, along with helping the kids and making a real difference. So just reach out to me by email if you're interested or have any interest in that. We'll be happy to help you do it. And it's life-changing. It's cheap. The travel agencies have told me that's a $10,000 trip, and our people are doing it for $3,000. So it's awesome. Have a wonderful week, and use some seller financing to help grow your business. Thank you, Jax. Thanks to everyone.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.